move on then. And, child abuse.
Child abuse in the news again, although one might say there's no right reason, but in this instance, Huw Edwards, who, having been found guilty of a number of offences pertaining to indecent images of children, received a 6-month suspended sentence, which means he will not go to prison. And the CPS say that WhatsApp chat between the male, this is a person he was communicating with, and Edwards was sexual in nature, and it also showed that Edwards was giving him gifts and money. Within the chat, there were numerous sexually explicit images, including 41 indecent images of children. Now, this gives us cause to think about the wider criminal justice system, but also about the overall attitude towards abuse of children. And we can start with his former employer, the BBC, who in a statement back in August said, Mr. Edwards pleaded guilty to an appalling crime. Had he been upfront when asked by the BBC about his arrest, we would never have continued to pay him public money. He has clearly undermined trust in the BBC and brought us into disrepute. Well, that might well be the case, but that's quite the conditional, in that the BBC are effectively washing their hands of responsibility by saying that they effectively had no further duty to investigate and should just take at face value anything that he told them. And of course, by extension, had he not said that and had this not come to light, then they would have been absolutely right in just sweeping it under the carpet and carrying on as normal. So that reflects very, very poorly on the BBC, but not necessarily in the way that they're suggesting. And we just go back now to UNICEF and to 1991, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think this is particularly pertinent since we head relentlessly towards the idea of one world government. But just to point to Article 19 and 34. Article 19, protection from violence, abuse and neglect. Governments must do all they can to ensure that children are protected from all forms of violence, abuse, neglect and bad treatment by their parents or anyone else who looks after them. Or Article 34, sexual exploitation. Governments must protect children from all forms of sexual abuse and exploitation. Well, quite. In the United Kingdom, we have enshrined in law the Protection of Children Act 1971. And this is what piece of legislation Edwards was effectively tried against. Either way, though, meaning that he in fact went to the Magistrates' Court and not Crown Court, the maximum being 10 years custody. But of course, we see that the incredible range of sentence being from a community order up to 9 years of custody. So just to look at the detail of it and how open to interpretation all of this is. He had 7 what are called Category A images, which I will define in a second. And it starts by saying, in most cases, the intrinsic character of the most serious of the offending images will initially determine the appropriate category. If, however, the most serious images are unrepresentative of the offender's conduct, a lower category may be appropriate. So effectively giving the magistrate or the judge a lot of room for manoeuvre, presumably depending on the defendant himself or herself. So with apologies for the nature of this, but it is written down by the Sentencing Council, indecent images, Category A, possession of images involving penetrative sexual activity, possession of images involving sexual activity with an animal or sadism. Now, Edwards had 7 of those and possibly many more, of course, because the device that was initially sought was not found. There was a delay. So it's entirely possible that a lot of evidence went missing. In terms of what this government, well, I was talking about track records concerning individuals, of course, the perennial reminder that Keir Starmer was indeed Director of Public Prosecutions when the Jimmy Savile case was effectively bungled. And of course, again, just like the BBC, being caught out and therefore talking about shortcomings. This is going back to 2013, but effectively absolutely not shouldering responsibility for what was not done. I should just point out that, first of all, UK Column does have a Substack page, so please, if you do use Substack, do make use of that. But you'll find a piece circled there in red about the 7 men committing offences. This is going back to Rotherham, but jailed for 106 years. And this, of course, points to the persistent failure by police to actually be able to deal with this under what was then Operation Stovewood, and these highlighted by the J report of 2014 going into the inquiry into child abuse in Rotherham. So there is absolute pedigree in this area of failure to deal with offences of this nature. Now, the reason this is so important is that the government, of course, does at its disposal have a judiciary with which it can dispense justice. And the reason I put it in those terms is that we have a big issue now about whether or not we have separation of powers. Of course, the interview with Claire Wills-Harrison, The Wonky Scales of Justice, out recently, we go into the failure of the separation of powers. And of course, over the last couple of months, we've seen a response to what's being called far-right violent disorder. And so we have the Home Office putting a tweet out being effectively tough, apparently, on crime, but only certain types. So let us be very clear: those violent and criminal attacks were not protests. They were not about grievance. They were thuggery, racism, and crime. The Prime Minister and I, being the Home Secretary, made it clear that criminals would pay the price for their violence, and we meant it. And that's from Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, back on September the 5th. So there are many examples one could pick out to highlight the utter hypocrisy and inconsistency of her position. And here we have BBC reporting man jailed for shouting at police dog and using racist slurs. So apparently fine to promulgate images of abused children, especially if you're a highly paid BBC correspondent reporter. But anyway, nonetheless, with political capital, of course, highlighted here by NSPCC in a sense, in that whilst it is, of course, fair to point out that these images are put about the place by the use of communications platforms, it's how exactly this is addressed. So we've got from the NSPCC saying that we're calling on tech companies to take swift and ambitious action to address what is currently happening on their platforms. And we're urging Ofcom to significantly strengthen its approach to tackling child sexual abuse through effective enforcement of the Online Safety Act. And we go back to the government document on end-to-end encryption, which is the way in which these messages apparently are made secure, and child safety. So in effect, one might say quite right to deal with this, but it's a question of where it goes and what the parameters are. But they specify in this document that there were over 34,000 offences in the UK relating to online indecent images of children in 2022, and that this means that they are reckoning that there are over 800,000 people who could pose a sexual threat to children, and the prevalence of the most severe forms of online child sexual abuse have more than doubled since 2020. So if indeed they can be corroborated, of course, very alarming statistics. But it should not be ignored that with the Online Safety Act and the way that the government is treating this, it is as though it is a lever with which to surveil and monitor communications at large, as opposed to necessarily dealing with the specific issue of child abuse. And the government's track record, or government's track records on this, are terrible. And one might say that the modus operandi of the government is simply being extended by its complete failure to deal with this, especially when there is the opportunity to use the phrase that, of course, the Home Secretary has many times over the last few months, to set an example. But the example that's been set by not giving Huw Edwards, a very public figure, a proper prison sentence is a terrible one. So I only need to remind you how children were treated in 2020 and 2021. Here we have a piece from the New Scientist where small children were forced to cover their faces for no apparently good reason whatsoever, with disastrous effects that were quite obviously known about at the time. And a reminder, of course, that the Committee on Vaccines recommended that children as young as 6 months old were given a drug that had not been trialled. So might be a deviation from sexual abuse of children, but nonetheless, the wider topic of child abuse is something this government is absolutely failing on.
Yes, okay, thank you, Charles, for that. Okay.